"This design is trash." The words echoed through the dead silent conference room, followed immediately by the devastating, crisp sound of the delete key being struck. In one ruthless, irreversible motion, my boss completely wiped out the master files of a project I had been bleeding over for the last 8 months. She didn't just critique my work, she permanently erased it right in front of the entire executive team. The giant projector screen instantly went black. Gasps rippled through the crowded room, but I stood there completely frozen, my heart pounding violently in my ears as the reality of her deliberate sabotage set in. I am Brianna Whitaker, 28 years old, and until that exact humiliating second, I was the top lead designer at Apex Creative here in Denver. For nearly a year, I had sacrificed absolutely everything for this agency. I lived on cold coffee and sheer panic, pulling relentless all-nighters that practically turned me into a walking ghost. The suffocating, toxic pressure of this job didn't just drain my professional soul, it violently bled into my home life. It created a massive, silent wedge between me and my partner, destroying the foundation of the family we were trying to build. My relationship was quietly crumbling, my mental health was deteriorating, and I had endured all of it for the sake of this one massive campaign that was supposed to secure my future. Instead, I was left standing there, staring at a blank screen and my boss's smug, calculated smile. The betrayal, however, ran so much deeper than just a cruel manager deleting my hard work out of spite. There were secrets hiding in that deleted file that could ruin lives. But to truly understand the sinister trap I had blindly walked into, and how I eventually orchestrated a payback so flawless they never saw it coming, we have to rewind. This nightmare actually started exactly 8 months ago. Before we get into my story, please leave a comment down below letting me know what time it is and what city you are watching from so I know how far my story has reached. 8 months ago, I joined Apex Creative in Denver full of hope. The agency had recently made significant waves across the industry by transforming sluggish, outdated businesses into modern cultural icons. I was inherently drawn to their boutique approach, believing it was the absolute perfect incubator for my specific, highly involved design philosophy. I did not view branding as merely slapping a trendy vector graphic next to a catchy slogan. To me, graphic design was essentially psychological translation. I required extensive onboarding sessions, actively asking founders about their defining life moments, their deep-rooted fears, and the granular details of their daily routines. I wanted to extract the actual, beating soul of a company before I ever opened Adobe Illustrator or sketched a single wireframe. When I walked through those sleek, frosted glass doors on my first day, I was handed a blank slate and complete creative autonomy to handle the agency's emerging portfolio. My first major assignment was conceptualizing the visual identity for Noah Carter. Noah was a former environmental scientist who had boldly pivoted to opening a hyper-sustainable, fair-trade coffee roastery. During our initial consultation, he spoke passionately about soil regeneration and the ethical treatment of farmers, possessing an earnest, rugged charm that immediately stood out. Most contemporary coffee brands lean heavily into predictable, safe aesthetics, minimalist white cups, or rustic, generic brown bags adorned with overused leaf motifs. I wanted to completely subvert that expectation. For Noah, I developed a rich, complex color palette inspired directly by the mineral composition of the specific volcanic dirt found on his partner farms in Guatemala. We utilized deep, grounding terracottas, striking ash grays, and vivid flashes of botanical green. I spent 3 weeks designing a bespoke typeface for his primary logo, meticulously crafting letters that subtly mimicked the jagged but beautiful topography of a mountain range. For the physical packaging, I sourced a specialized biodegradable hemp paper that felt rough and distinctly organic to the touch, entirely embossed with subtle tactile ridges. When I finally presented the comprehensive mock-ups, Noah was completely speechless. He ran his fingers slowly over the textured prototypes, stating that I had somehow materialized the exact vision he had carried in his head for years. Shortly after wrapping up that successful launch, I was assigned to Emma Langley. Emma was a brilliant, razor-sharp software engineer preparing to debut an innovative, AI-driven mental wellness application. The technology sector was notoriously saturated with cold, clinical aesthetics, sterile blues, harsh whites, and rigid, intimidating geometric layouts. Emma's application, however, was explicitly designed to guide users through severe anxiety and active panic attacks. It needed to feel distinctly human, offering immediate comfort and a deep sense of psychological safety. I discarded the traditional tech playbook entirely. Instead, I built a fluid, ever-changing visual identity anchored in soft, highly soothing gradients. The primary brand colors transitioned seamlessly between warm peach, gentle lavender, and a muted, earthy sage. The logo itself was an abstract, continuous loop without any sharp edges, subtly representing ongoing personal growth rather than promising an unrealistic, instant cure. I extended this language into the user interface, ensuring that every button click and screen transition felt like a gentle, reassuring exhale. Emma's reaction to the final presentation was profoundly emotional. She expressed that the branding did not look like software. It felt like a trusted friend reaching out a hand, which was exactly the atmosphere she needed to establish trust with her vulnerable user base. My third major undertaking was perhaps the most challenging, tasked with comprehensively rebranding Gabriel Stone. Gabriel was a third-generation luxury watchmaker whose family business was struggling to attract a younger, modern demographic without alienating their highly loyal, traditional collectors. He was fiercely protective of his heritage, but recognized the urgent, undeniable need for evolution. The tension between old-world craftsmanship and contemporary relevance required a highly delicate balance. I spent days just studying the intricate internal mechanisms of his timepieces, fascinated by the hidden, microscopic precision. I decided to carefully strip away the heavy, ornate crests his family had used for decades. In their place, I introduced a strikingly minimalist emblem composed of precise, interlocking gears forming an abstract hourglass. The typography utilized a modern, elongated serif font that projected quiet, unostentatious luxury. The foundational color was an incredibly deep, saturated midnight blue, contrasted exclusively by frosted, matte silver foil stamping. I even redesigned the physical unboxing experience, utilizing heavyweight, soft-touch materials that required a deliberate, slow pull to open, forcing the customer to savor the precious moment of revelation. Gabriel praised the work extensively, noting that the new identity respected his grandfather's legacy while confidently stepping into the future. The public response to these three distinct campaigns was overwhelmingly positive. Noah's Roastery saw enthusiastic lines stretching around the block on opening day, with lifestyle magazines praising the brand's authentic, earthy appeal. Emma's wellness app quickly secured a massive second round of funding, driven largely by user reviews highlighting the platform's exceptionally calming, intuitive design language. Gabriel's limited edition watch collection completely sold out entirely on pre-orders, effectively saving his family's historic legacy. Within the agency, these specific accounts quickly became our flagship success stories. I had seamlessly integrated my immersive, psychology-based design method into the company's daily workflow, delivering measurable, highly lucrative results that validated my artistic approach and firmly solidified my reputation as an indispensable asset to the executive team. At first, Courtney seemed to appreciate my approach. Courtney Ashford, the creative director, was a woman who practically worshipped operational efficiency. She measured our departmental success strictly in rapid turnaround times, maximized billable hours, and the seamless application of standardized visual templates. Initially, she offered approving nods during executive staff meetings, eagerly acknowledging the substantial revenue and critical acclaim my customized client campaigns brought into the agency. However, that superficial public approval quickly soured into visible, simmering irritation as she began to closely observe my actual, day-to-day workflow. She noticed the lengthy, in-depth client interviews, the sprawling physical mood boards occupying my desk, and the meticulous, intensely time-consuming psychological research I insisted on conducting before starting any digital drafting. To her rigidly corporate mindset, this immersive process was not a unique professional strength. It was an active, infuriating rebellion against her highly streamlined, heavily controlled operational machine. She viewed design strictly as an assembly line, and I was the wrench disrupting the gears. Her passive-aggressive displeasure started mildly, manifesting as brief, clipped remarks in the hallway about my unorthodox and overly indulgent time management. Soon, those passing remarks escalated into formal, closed-door disciplinary critiques. She summoned me into her private office, a notoriously sterile, intimidating space, dominated by frosted glass panels and sharp, polished steel accents. Sitting rigidly behind her massive, immaculate desk, she flatly informed me that my deeply involved creative methods were a financial luxury the agency could no longer afford to indulge. She argued that our profit margins were actively bleeding out through my so-called artistic indulgences. She explicitly demanded I cut my initial research phases by 80% and start heavily utilizing the company's pre-existing, generic asset libraries. When I respectfully attempted to articulate that the unique, high-tier quality of the final output heavily depended on that upfront intellectual investment, her eyes hardened noticeably. From that specific afternoon onward, our working dynamic fundamentally fractured. She began weaponizing her administrative authority, systematically burying me under an absolute avalanche of tedious, low-tier, mind-numbing administrative design tasks. I was suddenly instructed to manually format hundreds of lengthy internal compliance newsletters, resize generic promotional social media banners for largely inactive subsidiary accounts, and update the microscopic font kerning on years-old, discarded presentation decks. These monotonous, soul-crushing assignments were strategically and heavily piled on top of my existing, high-profile client roster. The underlying punitive message was crystal clear. If I stubbornly wanted to spend hours crafting bespoke typography or analyzing color psychology for my main clients, I would be forced to do it on my own unpaid time. That relentless, suffocating demand meant my personal time completely evaporated. My partner, Logan Pierce, bore the immediate, heavy brunt of this sudden, exhausting professional shift. He was a high school history teacher, naturally observant, incredibly patient, and deeply empathetic. He watched with growing, profound alarm as the vibrant, energetic woman he had decided to build a future with rapidly transformed into a chronically stressed, severely sleep-deprived shell of her former self. Before this corporate friction escalated, we had spent our peaceful evenings slowly renovating our small suburban home, painting walls and enjoying quiet dinners. Now, those half-empty paint cans sat gathering thick dust in the garage, our dinner conversations devolving into me staring blankly at my plate while frantically responding to Courtney's aggressive, late-night email directives. I regularly missed our scheduled weekend hikes, constantly cancelled planned date nights at the absolute last minute, and began suffering from intense, debilitating tension headaches that clouded my vision. Logan tried his absolute best to remain supportive, quietly bringing me plates of warm food at 2 a.m. while I sat hunched over my glowing, glaring dual monitors. One evening, finding me physically trembling in tears over a randomly crashed software application, he gently but firmly took my hands off the keyboard. He expressed his deep, unwavering concern for my rapidly deteriorating physical health and my fragile mental state, quietly asking if any agency job was truly worth permanently sacrificing my well-being and destroying our shared life. I had no logical defense to offer him, only a desperate, blinding fear of professional failure. Recognizing my extreme vulnerability and sheer, undeniable physical exhaustion, Courtney calculatedly decided to tighten the corporate leash even further. She called me into a mandatory, last-minute briefing and casually dropped a massive, heavily convoluted project brief onto the conference table. It was a complete, ground-up corporate visual redesign for a major, sprawling international logistics conglomerate. She smoothly pitched it to me as a rare, career-defining opportunity, framing it as a crucial test to prove I could handle the absolute upper echelon of the agency's enterprise portfolio. However, the sinister catch became immediately apparent. Instead of granting me the creative autonomy I critically required for such a colossal undertaking, she intentionally imposed incredibly restrictive, utterly suffocating design parameters. Every single preliminary sketch, digital color swatch, and foundational conceptual wireframe had to pass through her desk for direct, personal approval before I was legally permitted to proceed to the next phase. She instituted mandatory, highly critical daily progress reviews at exactly 8 in the morning, practically forcing me to work excessively late into the night just to have fresh, newly revised materials ready for her relentless morning scrutiny. By saddling me with the agency's highest stakes account and simultaneously stripping away my operational freedom, she ensured I was constantly kept off balance, perpetually anxious, and entirely dependent on her fickle validation. After weeks of intense work, I finally completed the 8-month branding project. The sheer volume of deliverables I had systematically generated over this grueling period was nothing short of staggering. The master folder contained a comprehensive, 300-page brand architecture guideline, meticulously detailing every conceivable visual asset. I had developed a proprietary typography system from scratch, specifically engineered for maximum legibility across both massive industrial shipping containers and microscopic mobile tracking interfaces. The color palette was locked down with precise CMYK, RGB, and Pantone values, ensuring absolute consistency whether printed on a corporate brochure in Tokyo or painted on a cargo ship in Rotterdam. Beyond the static graphics, I had animated dozens of dynamic logo stingers, constructed an entirely new user interface library for their proprietary logistics software, and directed a series of high-fidelity environmental mock-ups showcasing the new brand identity in real-world scenarios. Every single pixel was deliberate, every vector path mathematically perfect, and every conceptual decision backed by extensive market research and structural testing. The final 72 hours of the production sprint were a complete blur of caffeinated focus. I practically lived at my desk, meticulously scrubbing through the massive vector files to ensure there were no stray anchor points, no unlinked high-resolution images, and absolutely no formatting inconsistencies. I compiled the final presentation deck with surgical precision, arranging the narrative flow to take the viewer on a seamless journey from the client's outdated, disjointed visual past into its sleek, hyper-modern future. I rehearsed my talking points aloud in my empty apartment, timing my slide transitions to the exact second. I anticipated every potential counterargument regarding production costs or implementation timelines, preparing robust, data-backed countermetrics to defend my creative choices. When I finally clicked the export button to generate the master document, a profound, overwhelming wave of relief crashed over me. The physical toll was undeniable. My back ached constantly, my eyes were perpetually bloodshot, and my hands carried a slight tremor from sheer exhaustion. But the undeniable quality of the finished product made it all feel entirely justified. I had crafted an absolute masterpiece of corporate identity, a portfolio-defining triumph that easily rivaled the output of top-tier global agencies. I formally submitted the massive digital package to Courtney's secure server folder on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I attached a highly detailed, extremely professional executive summary outlining the core strategic pillars of the redesign and the projected market impact. I fully expected her standard protocol, a silent reception, followed by a tense, closed-door critique session a few days later, where she would aggressively nitpick microscopic details just to assert her dominance. I braced myself for the inevitable demands for minor, arbitrary revisions. Instead, the immediate aftermath was incredibly strange and entirely unprecedented. For 48 hours, there was absolute radio silence from her office. She did not summon me. She did not send a single heavily punctuated, late-night email. The suspense was agonizing, leaving me to endlessly refresh my inbox and second-guess my color choices. Then, on Thursday morning, a sudden calendar notification popped up on the screens of every single employee in the Denver office. Courtney had scheduled a mandatory all-hands agency assembly for the following afternoon. The subject line simply read, "Executive Review and Strategic Debrief, Global Logistics Rebrand." She had booked the main executive boardroom, a massive, imposing space, typically reserved strictly for quarter-end financial readouts or major structural reorganization announcements. When I saw that glowing notification, my heart immediately leaped into my throat. The sheer scale of the meeting invite was completely out of character for our standard operational workflow. We never reviewed individual client projects with the entire, unsiloed agency staff. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the screen as a warm, unfamiliar sensation began to spread through my chest. Genuine, unadulterated hope. I rationalized that the work was simply too powerful, too undeniably flawless for her to ignore or bury in a private session. I convinced myself that this was finally the pivotal turning point I had sacrificed so much to reach. Courtney was a harsh, unforgiving pragmatist, but she was also a businesswoman who recognized highly profitable, award-winning work. I believed she intended to use my massive, comprehensive project as a golden standard, a shining internal case study to inspire the junior design teams and demonstrate the absolute apex of the agency's creative capabilities. That evening, I returned home to Logan with a genuine, unburdened smile, for the first time in nearly a year. Over a quiet dinner, I animatedly explained the significance of the all-hands invite. I told him that the endless late nights, the cancelled weekend plans, and the overwhelming stress were finally culminating in the public, professional validation I so desperately craved. I carefully selected a sharp, professional outfit for the next day, mentally preparing to confidently walk my colleagues through the complex architecture of my design system. I went to sleep that night feeling an incredible sense of vindication, entirely convinced that my relentless dedication and undeniable talent had finally secured my permanent, respected place at the very top of the agency's hierarchy. The day of the department meeting arrived. The executive boardroom was a sprawling, intimidating cavern of dark mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grey Denver skyline. Over 50 employees were crammed into the space, including junior designers, senior account managers, and the entire upper-level administrative staff. The sheer density of people created a heavy, stifling atmosphere, thick with nervous, whispered speculation. I took a seat near the front row, carefully placing my notebook on the polished table. My posture was straight, my hands folded neatly, practically vibrating with a mix of profound exhaustion and quiet, eager anticipation. I truly believed this was the culmination of my relentless sacrifices, the exact moment my career would finally break through the corporate ceiling. Courtney stood at the head of the massive table, framed by the blindingly bright glare of the 4K projector screen. Her expression was entirely unreadable, a blank corporate mask that betrayed absolute zero emotion. She tapped her sleek stylus against the podium, demanding absolute silence. The low murmur of the room instantly vanished, replaced by a tense, heavy hush. With a sharp click of her remote, she bypassed my introductory slides and pulled up the raw, master asset directory on the server. She did not begin with a compliment. Instead, she launched into a meticulously planned, devastatingly brutal public dissection of my 8 months of labor. She projected the typography system and loudly mocked the custom kerning, claiming it would cause catastrophic rendering errors. She pulled up the deep color palette and dismissively labeled it as overly emotional and entirely inappropriate for a serious logistics firm. With every calculated sentence, she systematically tore down the logical foundations of my work, twisting my extensive user experience research into false accusations of wasteful overspending. "This design is trash." The words cut through the chilled air like a physical blade. Before anyone could process the sheer cruelty of the statement, she moved her cursor over the directory containing every single file, animation sequence, and wireframe I had painstakingly built. With a cold stare, directed entirely at me, she pressed the delete key. A prompt appeared, asking for confirmation to permanently erase the files. She clicked yes without a microsecond of hesitation. The screen flickered, instantly updating to show an empty, barren folder. A collective, horrified gasp rippled violently through the crowded room. Several junior designers physically shrank into their chairs, their eyes wide with terror. I sat there, completely frozen, my lungs refusing to draw in oxygen. The reality of her deliberate sabotage crashed down on me. She had never intended to promote me. This elaborate meeting was a public execution, designed specifically to humiliate me, shatter my professional confidence, and reassert her absolute dominance. She wanted to break me so thoroughly that I would never question her rigid authority again. In that suffocating, dead-silent void, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the tension. It was my phone. It had been sitting face up next to my notebook, supposedly set to silent, but a flagged VIP-level notification had overridden the basic settings. The screen illuminated brightly, vibrating violently against the thick mahogany table. Every eye in the room, including Courtney's furious glare, snapped toward the glowing device. I slowly looked down at the screen. The banner displayed a bold, urgent email from the Executive Recruitment Division of Horizon Creative Group. Horizon was a fiercely competitive global conglomerate, a legendary titan in the industry known for poaching top-tier talent and setting international design trends. I had quietly interviewed with them several months ago during the absolute lowest peak of Courtney's micromanagement. I had almost forgotten about the rigorous, multi-stage portfolio reviews I had secretly completed with their partners in New York. The preview text was unmistakably clear: formal offer of employment, global lead design director, base compensation $300,000 annually, effective immediately. I stared at those specific numbers. $300,000. It was nearly 4 times my current salary, accompanied by a title that completely dwarfed Courtney's regional position. A profound, shocking wave of absolute clarity washed over me, instantly melting the ice in my veins. The crushing humiliation I had felt just seconds prior completely evaporated, replaced by a surging, undeniable sense of power and profound liberation. I calmly picked up my phone, sliding it smoothly into my pocket. I did not break eye contact with Courtney as I deliberately stood up from my chair. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the overhead air conditioning unit. Courtney's smug, calculated smile faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing as she clearly struggled to process my complete lack of a terrified, emotional breakdown. "You are absolutely right, Courtney," I said, my voice shockingly steady, carrying perfectly across the massive room. "That specific design system is entirely too valuable to be wasted on this agency's archaic, suffocating infrastructure. Fortunately, I will no longer be an issue for your assembly line." I calmly picked up my leather notebook. "I resign. Effective immediately. The physical hardware on my desk belongs to the company, but as per my original employment contract, all unapproved, uninvoiced conceptual assets remain my intellectual property. Good luck rebuilding that global logistics campaign from scratch." Without waiting for her to formulate a sputtering response, I turned my back on the projector, walked purposefully down the center aisle of the boardroom, and pushed through the heavy glass doors, leaving the stunned, silent agency behind me forever. My first week at Horizon Creative Group felt completely different. The transition was not merely a change in physical location. It was a profound shift in professional reality. I stepped into a sprawling, light-filled corner office, equipped with state-of-the-art rendering technology, surrounded by a culture deeply rooted in creative respect. I was hired as a global lead design director, and the executive board immediately treated me with the autonomy that title demanded. There were no mandatory morning check-ins to monitor my screen time, no restrictive parameters on my research phases, and absolutely no pushback on my resource allocations. I was handed a substantial departmental budget, introduced to a highly capable team of self-sufficient senior designers, and given the absolute freedom to execute my strategic vision. I threw myself completely into my new portfolio, entirely focused on the future. I strictly adhered to my standard non-solicitation agreement, knowing better than to legally jeopardize my new position. I made zero attempts to contact my former roster, intentionally leaving that chapter firmly closed. However, that silence did not last long. On a brisk Thursday morning, my direct office line rang with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, the deep, familiar voice on the other end caught me entirely off guard. It was Noah. He sounded incredibly frustrated, his usual calm, grounded demeanor entirely fractured. He explained that he had called my old extension for a routine quarterly planning session, only to be abruptly informed by a receptionist that I had departed. His account had been hastily reassigned to a junior coordinator who immediately tried to push a generic, highly synthetic promotional template for his upcoming winter roast launch. Noah explained that the new team completely ignored the earthy, organic ethos we had painstakingly built. Instead, they pitched glossy, mass-market packaging concepts that directly contradicted his sustainable, fair trade business model. He felt completely misunderstood and deeply disrespected by the sudden drop in strategic care. He stated unequivocally that he did not want to work with an agency. He wanted to work with the specific architect of his brand. He had tracked down my new employment through a mutual supply vendor and asked outright how quickly he could transfer his entire retainer to Horizon. Before I could fully process the legal logistics of onboarding his roastery, I received an urgent, direct message on my professional networking profile. It was Emma. She was entering the critical final stages of preparing a major software update for her mental wellness application and was in a state of absolute panic. We scheduled a secure video call later that afternoon. Emma looked visibly stressed, rubbing her temples as she described the disastrous state of her latest interface expansion. The new team assigned to her account had fundamentally failed to grasp the psychological nuance required for her platform. They had replaced our carefully curated, soothing visual language with harsh, high-contrast primary colors and rigid, sharp-edged interactive elements that triggered anxiety rather than alleviating it. When she demanded revisions, she was met with rigid, bureaucratic pushback about standardized tech aesthetics and suddenly billed for excessive, out-of-scope hourly overages. Emma emphasized that her entire investor valuation depended on user trust, and the current output was actively destroying that foundation. She insisted on moving her corporate contract immediately, regardless of any early termination penalties she might incur. The final, most definitive shift occurred on Friday evening. I was wrapping up my week when my personal cell phone buzzed. Gabriel never used email for serious matters. He preferred direct, old-fashioned voice communication. The luxury watchmaker was absolutely livid, a stark contrast to his usually refined, measured tone. He had recently requested a minor, elegant extension of his branding for a highly exclusive, limited edition titanium dive watch. The response he received was a hastily assembled, terribly formatted presentation deck, utilizing cheap, off-the-shelf typography that completely insulted his family's multi-generational legacy. The new account manager had treated his prestigious heritage brand like a fast-fashion startup, demonstrating zero respect for the microscopic precision and quiet luxury that defined his products. Gabriel informed me that he had already instructed his corporate legal team to formally sever ties with his previous agency due to a fundamental, undeniable breach of quality standards. He then firmly requested an in-person meeting with Horizon's executive board to discuss establishing a massive, multi-year exclusive partnership. I sat at my new desk, looking quietly at the 3 names jotted down on my leather notepad. Noah, Emma, and Gabriel represented 3 of the most lucrative, critically acclaimed accounts I had ever managed. I had not sent a single email, made a single phone call, or exerted any professional pressure whatsoever to bring them over. They had simply experienced the glaring, unmistakable void left by my sudden absence. They immediately recognized the stark, painful difference between genuine, psychology-driven design and a soulless, automated corporate assembly line. Without hesitation, I calmly gathered my notes, opened a new encrypted email draft, and forwarded their direct contact information to Horizon's internal acquisitions and legal department, officially initiating the formal transfer protocols to bring them on board. Meanwhile, things at Apex Creative started to unravel. The rapid departure of 3 flagship accounts in a single week sent an unprecedented, paralyzing shockwave through the agency's polished, modern corridors. When the formal, legally binding termination notices from the Sustainable Roastery, the Wellness Application, and the Luxury Watchmaker officially cleared the internal billing department, the immediate financial impact was catastrophic. These were not minor, easily replaceable boutique contracts. They were massive, high-visibility retainers that firmly anchored the company's entire quarterly revenue projections. Without those foundational, highly lucrative pillars, the financial forecasts instantly plummeted into deep, alarming red territory. The junior designers, who had been suddenly and unfairly thrust into managing these complex accounts without any proper strategic guidance or transitional briefings, were left completely bewildered. They entirely lacked the proprietary psychological research frameworks necessary to maintain the intricate, customized brand identities I had established. This resulted in a chaotic, desperate scramble that only further alienated the remaining, already deeply skeptical client base. Rumors of my explosive, unscripted resignation spread like wildfire through the open-plan cubicles, entirely shattering the agency's carefully manufactured illusion of absolute corporate stability. The sudden, violent hemorrhaging of capital quickly caught the attention of Ryan Ellison. Ryan was the principal founder and chief executive officer of Apex Creative, a man who historically preferred to remain entirely insulated from the messy daily creative operations. He typically focused strictly on high-level investor relations, aggressive firm expansion, and securing exclusive international partnerships. However, an unexpected 30% drop in projected annual billing was utterly impossible for him to ignore. He descended from the isolated, glass-walled executive suite, demanding immediate, concrete explanations for the sudden, embarrassing exodus of their most respected partnerships. Ryan possessed a notoriously short temper, a ruthless business acumen, and absolutely zero tolerance for administrative excuses. He instituted grueling, mandatory financial audits, ruthlessly grilling the senior account directors in windowless conference rooms, demanding to know exactly why their flagship clients were abruptly breaking ironclad contracts and fleeing directly to a major industry competitor. The atmosphere within the Denver office rapidly transformed from merely high pressure to outright toxic paranoia, with department heads frantically shifting blame and fabricating excuses to avoid Ryan's swift, unforgiving corporate retribution. At the absolute center of this rapidly expanding, uncontrollable disaster was Courtney. Desperate to justify the devastating loss of guaranteed revenue and fiercely protect her own highly compensated executive position, she aggressively attempted to salvage the deteriorating situation. She heavily relied on her standard, rigid operational playbook, immediately forcing her already exhausted design team into mandatory, uncompensated weekend overtime. She stubbornly believed she could seamlessly replace the lost boutique accounts by quickly pushing through the massive, highly publicized international logistics rebranding project. However, there was a glaring, mathematically insurmountable problem. she had permanently deleted the only existing master files, and my highly specialized, proprietary design system had walked out the door with me. Forcing her junior staff to rebuild an 8-month, intensely researched corporate architecture from absolute scratch in a mere matter of weeks was fundamentally impossible. When she hastily presented the newly manufactured, drastically rushed concepts to the logistics conglomerate's incredibly demanding board of directors, the rejection was brutal, public, and immediate. The client easily recognized the glaring, insulting drop in quality, actively criticizing the generic typography, the uninspired, flat color palettes, and the complete lack of a coherent visual strategy. They officially paused the entire multi-million-dollar redesign initiative on the spot, explicitly citing a severe, irreparable lack of confidence in the agency's current creative leadership. Courtney's desperate, arrogant gamble had spectacularly backfired, leaving her dangerously exposed, professionally isolated, and completely out of viable options. Far removed from that spiraling corporate implosion, my own weekend looked entirely different. For the first time in nearly a full year, I woke up naturally, entirely without a blaring alarm clock and the crushing, suffocating weight of impending impossible deadlines. I walked into the sunlit kitchen to find Logan casually flipping thick blueberry pancakes, upbeat indie rock music playing softly from a small wireless speaker on the counter. We had finally decided to tackle the abandoned home renovation project that had been perpetually delayed by my previous exhausting employment. After finishing breakfast, we carried those forgotten, heavy, dust-covered paint cans into the living room, spread out thick canvas drop cloths over the hardwood floors, and spent the entire afternoon rolling a warm, incredibly inviting shade of rich terracotta onto the bare, white walls. It was a wonderfully messy, intensely physical, and profoundly satisfying process. We debated loudly and enthusiastically over exactly where to hang a series of vintage architectural blueprints we had bought years ago at a local flea market, occasionally stopping to laugh and wipe accidental paint splatters off each other's faces. Logan excitedly pulled up a digital map on his tablet, meticulously mapping out a completely spontaneous, 2-week coastal road trip through the Pacific Northwest that we were finally going to take next month. There were no hushed, worried conversations about my mental health, no frantic checking of incoming email notifications, and absolutely no looming, sickening dread about returning to a toxic office on Monday morning. We were simply two equal partners actively building our shared life again, completely reconnected, entirely unburdened, and focused exclusively on a bright, sustainable future. 3 months after I left, I received an unexpected call. I was sitting at my drafting table at Horizon, carefully reviewing a complex physical architectural prototype for an upcoming international design exhibition, when my personal cell phone vibrated sharply against the sleek wood surface. The caller ID displayed a private, unlisted number. Out of sheer curiosity, and assuming it might be an overseas vendor, I answered. The voice on the other end was instantly recognizable, though the tone was drastically different from the harsh, authoritative bark I was accustomed to hearing echoing through the executive suites of my former employer. It was Ryan. He completely bypassed the standard, polite introductory pleasantries, opting instead to dive straight into what sounded like a meticulously rehearsed, highly strategic corporate negotiation. Ryan began by adopting a surprisingly conciliatory posture, awkwardly attempting to frame my sudden departure as a mutual, unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a direct consequence of blatant managerial sabotage. He then laid out an incredibly aggressive, highly lucrative proposition. He officially offered me a newly created, unparalleled position, Senior Vice President of Global Design Strategy. This bespoke role was ostensibly designed to sit entirely outside the standard operational hierarchy, granting me absolute, unchecked creative jurisdiction over the agency's most valuable enterprise accounts. He promised a dedicated, unlimited departmental budget, the immediate authority to hire my own hand-picked team of international specialists, and a staggering base salary that comfortably eclipsed even the generous compensation package I was currently receiving. To sweeten the deal further, he explicitly mentioned a lucrative equity stake in the firm, essentially offering me a permanent seat at the absolute highest executive table. Furthermore, he heavily implied, with cold corporate detachment, that the specific management layers that had previously caused me grief were currently undergoing severe internal performance reviews, guaranteeing that I would operate with total impunity. I allowed him to completely finish his extensive, heavily jargon-laden pitch without a single interruption. I listened calmly to the faint rustle of papers in the background as he confidently waited for me to accept what he clearly believed was an irresistible, career-defining olive branch. When the heavy silence stretched on for a few seconds, I finally spoke. My voice was incredibly steady, completely devoid of any lingering anger, resentment, or professional bitterness. I politely, but absolutely unequivocally, rejected his entire offer. I did not stop at a simple, unexplained refusal. I provided him with a precise, unflinching explanation. I clearly articulated that my decision had absolutely nothing to do with the impressive financial figures or the elevated corporate title he had just presented. I explained that his agency suffered from a fundamental, terminal cultural rot that could never be cured by simply restructuring an organizational chart or throwing massive amounts of capital at a single, highly profitable employee. The entire foundational ethos of his company was built entirely on treating creative strategy as a highly inconvenient, easily expendable obstacle to maximizing billable hours. I told him that an agency cannot structurally punish genuine innovation, systematically weaponize administrative tasks, and actively suffocate artistic exploration for years, only to suddenly pretend to deeply value those exact same qualities the very second their profit margins begin to severely hemorrhage. The rigid, automated assembly line mentality was permanently baked into the very foundation of his business model. I emphasized that accepting his golden cage would still ultimately leave me trapped inside a cage, forced to continuously battle an entrenched corporate ideology just to execute basic, standard-level design work. I pointed out that a title cannot shield a designer from an ecosystem that inherently despises the creative process. I already possessed an environment at my new firm that inherently respected my psychological methodology, an environment that nurtured bold ideas without requiring a constant, exhausting war of attrition for basic professional autonomy. I told him my creativity was no longer for sale to the highest bidder who lacked fundamental respect for the craft. The reaction on the other end of the line was a profound, stunned silence. Ryan was a man who was entirely accustomed to succalculations. The fundamental concept of someone actively refusing a massive amount of money and a prestigious C-suite title based purely on philosophical and ethical principles seemed to completely short-circuit his business acumen. He desperately tried to counter, stammering out a promise to double the signing bonus, completely missing the entire point of my speech. When he realized my stance was utterly immovable, the previously smooth, conciliatory tone completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sharp, defensive coldness. He stiffly attempted to lecture me about long-term industry loyalty and the perceived dangers of burning valuable professional bridges, his arrogance desperately trying to mask the undeniable reality of his complete defeat. I did not engage with his sudden shift in demeanor. I simply wished him genuine luck with his ongoing, difficult restructuring efforts, firmly stated that my current prototype required my immediate attention, and calmly ended the connection. 6 months later, I look back at everything that happened. The sheer contrast between my life then and my daily reality now is almost difficult to fully articulate. At Horizon, I was recently elevated to executive partner, a prestigious title that genuinely reflects collaborative, visionary leadership rather than dictatorial, fear-based control. I just finalized a sweeping, globally integrated visual identity campaign for a massive European sustainable energy coalition, a deeply rewarding project that recently secured 3 major international design awards. But far more importantly than any corporate accolade, the suffocating, crushing physical weight of constant dread has entirely vanished from my existence. I no longer experience those terrifying, blinding tension headaches that used to ruin my evenings. My weekends with Logan are fiercely protected and deeply cherished, filled with genuine, relaxed presence rather than exhausted, silent recovery from a brutal work week. Our relationship has deepened profoundly, built on a renewed, unshakable foundation of mutual support and shared joy, completely untouched by the toxic residue of my former corporate burnout. We are finally living the peaceful, vibrant life we had always planned. Through the tightly knit, remarkably interconnected network of the Denver advertising community, I eventually learned the specific, highly realistic details concerning Courtney's inevitable professional fallout. Her downfall was not a sudden, dramatic, cinematic explosion, but rather a slow, deeply humiliating unraveling, when that massive, heavily publicized international logistics contract permanently evaporated due to her absolute inability to deliver high-quality, strategic assets. The agency's executive board required a definitive, immediate scapegoat. Stripped of the top-tier talent she had routinely exploited and actively suppressed to artificially inflate her own departmental metrics, her actual, glaring lack of genuine creative leadership was laid entirely bare for the upper management to see. She attempted to predictably shift the blame onto her overworked junior staff, but the internal audits proved otherwise. She was quietly, unceremoniously terminated. However, the true, lasting consequence of her actions manifested vividly in the harsh aftermath. She quickly discovered that her notoriously ruthless, hypercritical reputation had actively preceded her into the job market. Executive search firms and rival corporate agencies had already heard the widespread, damaging rumors of her draconian management style and the resulting catastrophic exodus of flagship accounts. She was universally deemed an active, toxic liability. After several agonizing months of highly visible, increasingly desperate professional networking, she was ultimately forced to accept a mid-level, largely administrative marketing coordinator position for a regional, heavily bureaucratic insurance firm. I heard she now spends her incredibly monotonous days precisely where her rigid mindset belongs, managing generic, pre-made spreadsheet templates and fiercely enforcing uninspired, standard formatting guidelines, entirely stripped of the glamour, prestige, and executive power she once wielded so destructively. Looking back, surviving that entire nightmare was a brutal, completely exhausting, but ultimately necessary crucible. The true, enduring value I want to share with anyone listening to this story is the profound, undeniable importance of recognizing and fiercely protecting your own intrinsic professional and personal worth. Toxic workplaces operate exactly like psychological parasites. They systematically drain your inner confidence, aggressively convince you that your unique strengths are actually problematic liabilities, and carefully manipulate you into believing that their fundamentally broken, abusive system is the only possible reality. They rely entirely on your deep-seated fears, the paralyzing fear of financial instability, the fear of professional failure, and the fear of starting completely over, to keep you trapped in a perpetual, silent cycle of exploitation. But you must actively realize that your specific talent, your relentless dedication, and your highly nuanced approach to your craft cannot be mass-produced on a sterile corporate assembly line. When a manager or an institution fundamentally disrespects your unique process and actively attempts to compress your vast capabilities into a rigid, mediocre box, It is never a reflection of your inadequacy. It is a glaring, undeniable reflection of their own profound limitations. Walking away from a highly secure paycheck and a heavily established corporate title is incredibly terrifying. It requires taking a massive, completely unscripted leap into the absolute unknown. However, choosing to remain in a hostile environment that actively destroys your fragile mental health, quietly alienates you from your family, and slowly suffocates your artistic integrity is a far more dangerous, ultimately devastating gamble. Your physical and emotional well-being is not a negotiable currency to be casually traded for a year-end financial bonus or a fleeting, superficial nod of executive approval. Never allow a deeply insecure, toxic leader to dictate your professional narrative or diminish the high standard of excellence you hold yourself to. True, lasting power does not emanate from a corner office or an intimidating job title. It comes directly from the absolute unwavering integrity of your work and the sheer courage to finally demand the genuine respect you have rightfully earned. Thank you so much for staying with me and listening to this personal journey all the way to the very end. I truly hope my experience brings some necessary clarity, validation, or encouragement to anyone currently facing a similar, exhausting battle. Have you ever had to bravely walk away from a toxic boss, a suffocating job, or an unfair situation to protect your own peace and sanity? Please share your thoughts, your own difficult experiences, and your personal victories down in the comments below. I would absolutely love to read them, support you, and know exactly how far this conversation has reached.